the record reflect the presence of multiple parties. Present, you may be seated. The jury is present. Good afternoon. Do you understand that you're still under oath?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. You may continue with your examination.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Goff, I think where we left off right before lunch, we were discussing about maggots swirling or large concentration of maggots swirling around. Is there a term that you use to describe a large concentration of maggots?
Yes, there is.
And what term is that?
We typically call it a maggot mass.
And I'm going to show you a series of photographs that's already in evidence. First of all, you did testify earlier before lunch that you came to Maui sometime on June 2nd of 2014, and I guess met up with Mr. Anthony Earls, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you testified also that he brought you to the scene by the Nua Bay Area, is that correct?
That's correct.
Now,
Yeah, I'm going to object. It comes out of some specs, not in evidence.
Well, yeah, at least for the time being, why don't we cover
Yeah,
a little bit of that from a foundational standpoint?
thank you, Andrew. When you came to Maui on June 2nd of 2014, do you recall who you met up with?
Yes, I met up with Anthony Earls, detective. You were present.
And at that time, were you taken to anywhere in particular on the island of Maui?
Yes, it was the area which I was given to understand was the scene of the recovery.
The recovery of all the maggots?
Yes.
But when you say recovery of the maggots, you mean the maggots by the soil indentation?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity to, I guess, walk through that area yourself?
Yes, I did.
And your permission to publish at this time states Exhibit 124. Uh, 62 and states Exhibit 157. These are already admitted into evidence.
Permission granted. Proceed.
Thank you. Okay, now, Dr. Goff, I'm going to show you, first of all, State's Exhibit 124, which is in evidence. When you're taken to the scene area by Tony Earls and Detective Hamilton, does this look familiar to you? I'm sorry, it's on the monitor.
Okay. Yes, it does.
And showing you State's Exhibit 62. In order to get to the scene, do you recall how you got there?
Oh, yeah, access is going down that particular road.
And showing you State's Exhibit. Okay, can you see from where you're sitting State's Exhibit 157?
Yes.
Okay, and drawing your attention to the middle portion of the photograph, what is that you see there?
It appears to be what I would term a maggot mass.
And I'm going to go.
Maggots that was in that particular area, and the food resource is no longer there.
Let's start with the food resource. Is a food resource consistent with a human body that's in a decomposed state?
Yes.
And what, if anything, regarding the decomposed state is a food resource for the maggots, or this maggot mass?
Well, as I said, the maggots prefer prize a food resource.
Now, if the maggots in these photographs were to be moving in a swirling pattern or a circular pattern, would that indicate anything to you?
It would indicate that most probably the food resource was gone.
When you say gone, removed?
Removed, or it had been completely expended.
Okay. In this instance, though, if a decomposed body were to have begun with an oviposition as soon as you stated back on February 10th of 2014, and this photograph taken on February 14th, approximately 4 days later, on 2014, would the maggots consume an entire human body during that short time period?
No.
And how about the bones or anything else? Would that still be evident there?
Okay, yeah, the maggots would not feed on the bones. They did not particularly like any tendon or cartilage. Certainly not hair.
And I have a couple more questions along those lines. If a pig carcass were 100 or 200 yards away from the maggot mass that you just saw, are maggots migratory, or meaning would they move from one food mass to another food mass that's approximately 100 to 200 yards away?
That distance, I would say no.
And why is it that you say, why would you say no?
Okay. First, you have the problem of attracting the maggots to the remote food resource. In studies that I've conducted where carcasses have been significantly closer, I've observed no migration from one carcass to the other. It's been a matter of some discussion, but by and large, the conclusions that are generally drawn are that the maggots are not going to migrate from one carcass to another.
And when you say that you have done some studies with respect to carcasses that are much closer, now according to the PowerPoint presentation that you did, the life cycle of a fly, at some point the maggots or the maggot mass that we just saw in that exhibit, if they're fed and they mature enough, will they eventually evolve into a fly?
Yes, they would enter the puparial stage, undergo the second embryology, and an adult fly would emerge.
And in this case, where the food source is no longer there, and let's say they don't have enough food to mature, what happens to them?
They die.
Source, and that food source is removed, and they don't have enough food to, I guess, fully develop. What happens to them at that point?
At that point, the maggot would die.
And the fact that they're moving around, does that mean anything
Typically, when you have a mass of maggots, you do have constant motion. This is just more or less the nature of the beast.
And I'm almost done here. Will maggots, I guess, feed on a person that is not deceased, but is either unconscious or sleeping?
Okay. We have a condition that's known as myiasis, and this occurs in some species of flies, and this actually involves the obligatory feeding by maggots on live tissue. Generally, in order to have this happen, there has got to be a wound that is already present, and an individual who is simply sleeping or unconscious, you would not have the flies coming in and laying their eggs.
You would not have the flies coming in and laying their eggs?
Not on someone who is simply sleeping or unconscious. If you have a putrefying wound, they will come in and occasionally lay their eggs there.
And last question, Dr. Goff. Did everything you just testified to, is it based on a reasonable degree of scientific certainty within the field of forensic entomology?
Yes, it is.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Cross-examination, Mr. Chairman.
Good afternoon, Dr. Goff.
Afternoon.
Now, you would agree, especially in response to that last question, all the times you've given here are estimates, is that correct?
That's correct.
And are you familiar with the term junk in, junk out?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury what that means?
Your conclusions are really only as valid as the validity of the data that you use to formulate them.
So, inaccurate or incomplete data can lead to faulty results, is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Okay. And with regards to determining accumulated degree hours, a couple of additional degrees, let's say 2, on a 24-hour period would, if we increased it by 2 degrees, that would increase a 24-hour period by 48 accumulated degree hours.
Yes.
Okay. And how does humidity play into this?
Humidity, basically, if it is very dry in the habitat, then you'll have a problem with desiccation of the maggots. That typically is not something we're going to encounter here in Hawaii.
Now, the weather data you were provided was from Maui Police Department, is that
Yes.
correct?
From the National Weather Service station.
And that was the National Weather Station at Kahului, correct?
Yeah.
And you weren't provided with any weather data regarding the weather at the relevant time periods, which I would say would be the February 9th through the 15th for Wailuku Bay, is that correct?
That's correct.
And isn't it true that if you were instructing people on the collection of maggots, you would instruct them to take the temperature at the scene?
Yes.
In fact, that's one thing in the literature that is advised, is to take a thermometer with you so you can take the temperature at the scene.
Yes.
And it'd also be advised not to take the temperature in direct sunlight, is that correct?
That's correct.
And as well as that you would take the ambient temperature, meaning the temperature surrounding the scene, in the air, correct?
You would take the ambient temperature. I would also tend to take any maggot mass temperatures.
Absolutely, and that's what the literature suggests is important, is to take the maggot mass temperature as well, is that correct?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, was any of that done here?
No.
So none of that information was provided to you?
That's true.
Now, would you agree that oviposition can take place within minutes after death?
Yes.
And you indicated on direct that oviposition generally does not occur during night, correct?
That is the general consensus. There are situations in which you will find nocturnal oviposition.
And flies generally don't fly at night, correct?
That's correct.
And so those would be flies that happened upon a carcass by walking?
Or spending the night, typically when it comes to where to spend the night, the flies will go into low foliage, they'll get into grasses, and they will sit there and spend the hours of darkness there.
And now, with respect, though, going back to the general premise that oviposition doesn't occur at night, is it fair to say that the literature supports that if you do have a carcass put out at night, that oviposition will take place within a few hours after sunrise?
That would be typically what I would anticipate.
And especially if the carcass had been rotting throughout the night, is that correct?
Yes.
And so with the weather data you were given, is it true that the sunrise on February 12th was a few minutes before 7 a.m.?
That sounds appropriate. I don't have the data here with me.
Now, you said that when the food source is removed, the maggots die. Is that correct?
Yes, if there's nothing to eat, they will essentially starve to death.
Okay. And the maggots that were found, there are maggots found on fingernails, correct?
I believe from the...
And so if they were eating, that would have been on any tissue, that would have had to have been on any tissue that was remaining on the fingernails?
That would be my assumption.
And you had indicated on direct, too, that when the food source is taken away, even if they don't migrate, they do move away.
Not necessarily. They will move possibly a short distance looking for an additional food resource. In this case, not a matter of more than a couple of feet.
Okay. But they wouldn't stay on a non-food source item.
Unless there is some indication of the food resource having been there in a fairly recent past. So if you have body fluids that are present there, if you have blood, they'll stay there because that basically is the only food resource that they know of.
Okay. Now, the maggots that were collected off the... Okay, and let me get this first. All the collection times were reported to be at midnight, is that correct?
No, basically the midnight is when they were placed into refrigeration.
Okay, and that's what would stop the growth?
That would stop the growth.
Okay, and so that was, there was items collected on the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and all of those, according to the data you have, were put into refrigeration at midnight?
Yes.
And the maggots that were collected from the fingernails, those...
Judge, I do object as to, that's not inaccurate statement in the plural.
Did you receive
Sorry,
information?
I was just seeing the objection.
You were given a specimen collected from a nail, correct?
It's a specimen container was labeled as nail D.
Okay. And do you know how many specimens that had in it?
I don't have that listed here.
Okay. And those specimens were the, I'm really going to mangle this word, Chrysoma megacyte?
Chrysomia megacephala.
The ones that collected from the nail, or the one collected from the nail, they were not the third
Instar.
yes, thank you.
No.
They were not of the third instar variety. Is that
No, they
correct?
were not.
It was just the second.
Correct.
And that had an additional 2 days to develop from the ones that were collected on the 13th, correct?
They were collected 2 days later. I don't know what the fate of the nail was. I don't know what happened there. All I know is there was a 2-day gap.
Okay. And though, okay, we don't know what happened, but that 2-day gap would account for over 1,000 accumulated degree hours, correct?
I'd have to sit and look at it, but it sounds about right.
Well, do you remember the,
Actually, probably a little bit less than 1,000.
isn't it true that the 14th was hotter than the 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th, is it, or 13th, is that correct?
From my recollection, yes, although I don't recall.
And the 15th was even hotter than the 14th, correct?
I believe so.
Okay, and so with regards to the 14th, I have everything in Fahrenheit, does about 76 degrees Fahrenheit sound about correct?
Sounds about it, in the ballpark.
And about 80 degrees Fahrenheit on the 15th?
Again, in the ballpark.
And with respects to the days preceding the 14th, the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, those, and I should say, we're talking about average temperature, correct?
Well, I was working not with averages, but rather with hourly temperature data.
Okay. But the max from the 13th, well, let me rephrase that, let me remove that. The mean temperature on the 13th was about 74 degrees, does that sound about right?
Again, not having that in front of me, it sounds, yeah, again, in the ballpark, but I can't really.
And, you know, I do object if council is going to be questioning the specific numbers, they should be shown to Dr. Goff so he can make an accurate comment.
He said he was given to him by the Maui Police Department.
I will sustain the objection. It does. I think the witness is making it clear that without the ability to refresh his memory, he's only indicating that you're in the ballpark.
Okay, that's fair enough. But you do recollect that the 14th and the 15th were the hottest 2 days out of that day range, is that correct?
Yeah, you do have the general pattern.
Okay. And if the 14th had an average temperature of 76 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 15th had an average temperature of 78 degrees Fahrenheit, would it be fair to say that that would equate to over 1,000 degree hours, accumulated degree hours for those 2 days?
Judge, again, I do object because the degrees that Dr. Goff was speaking with, that was Celsius, council is working with Fahrenheit, which is going to be much higher. And that clouds the issue right there if we're going to talk numbers. So that is misleading.
Your Honor, I'm being very specific in Fahrenheit to not mislead him, so that he can make the calculation.
Again, the sum or the conclusion about the 1,000 hours, that is misleading if we don't talk about Celsius.
Well, let's have the witness assist us with this if you want to pursue that question, but we may need to give him the time to make the conversions.
So, let me see if I have what you wrote down. You're working in Fahrenheit.
Yes.
Okay, so all of your temperatures are in Fahrenheit. You're saying 1,000 degree hours based on a Fahrenheit calculation, which we typically don't use.
Okay.
Okay, we tend to do our calculations in Celsius.
Well, do you know the conversion for what 76 degrees Celsius would be, Fahrenheit would be in Celsius?
Not if I can do it.
Okay, does, well, let me ask you this, for 80 degrees Fahrenheit, is that about 26.6 degrees
That's
Celsius?
correct.
And 26.6 degrees Celsius, would that equate over a 24-hour period to approximately 638 accumulated degree hours? If you need to do the calculation.
It sounds right, but let me, if I may.
Please do.
giving me an answer that I don't quite understand. Because it's way off base.
Take your time.
638.4.
38.4. So if we're talking around a mean temperature of 80 degrees in a 24-hour period, it would be how many?
638.4.
Okay, and 76 degrees Fahrenheit is about 24 degrees Celsius, is that correct?
No, just do 76. I'm going to change calculators if you don't mind. I think it's time for a new fan.
He's about that already once in trial.
Hmm?
We already had that issue in trial once.
Okay. Yeah, so 76 would be about 24.4.
Okay, and then if we were to times that by 24 hours, we'd have approximately 576 accumulated degree hours.
Come up 586.
586. And so between the, assuming that's correct, that 76 mean temperature on the 14th and 80 mean temperature on the 15th, you'd agree that would equate to over 1,000 accumulated degree hours?
Yeah, combination of the two, yes.
Correct. And you said that for the smallest of the maggots found, that it would take approximately 1,014 accumulated degree hours for them to get at that size, correct?
Right.
And that would be the size consistent with the specimen collected from the nails, correct?
Correct.
And so that would indicate that possibly the nail wasn't brought out there till the 13th?
Again, this is assuming something I have no way of knowing.
I understand that, but if we're looking at, you have enough time
Well,
between the 14th and the 15th to achieve this stage of development on what was collected off the fingernail, correct?
yes. However, I can't really say anything regarding the availability of the nail, except for some reason oviposition and maggot development did not take place on that nail.
Okay, well the bra that was found on the 14th, again, that would have had a full 24 hours of additional development from the maggots that were collected on the 13th, correct?
Yes.
And the bra did not, like the maggots that were collected on the 13th were slightly larger than the maggots collected from the bra, is that correct?
13. Yes, you're looking at 10 to 12 millimeters versus
11?
9 to 11 millimeters.
So then the maggots collected from the bra, they were not as large as some of the maggots that were collected from the clothing, from the maggots collected from the clothing on the 13th, correct?
That's correct.
And that's despite, again, an extra 24 hours worth of developmental time being available.
Yes.
On a day that was hotter than the 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, or even 13th, correct?
Yes. That's making the assumption that all collections that were made included all size categories that were present.
right? Which we don't know, correct?
Correct.
Because you would agree, the manner in which this was collected would not be the way you would have personally collected it. Is that fair to say?
No, as an entomologist, I would proceed somewhat differently. Or I would say that this is actually better than a good deal of material that I received.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I said this actually is processed somewhat better than a good deal of the material that's been submitted over the years.
Fair enough. Now, you talked about how wrapping a body can, I guess, delay oviposition, correct?
That's correct.
In fact, you speak of that example with the tape and the ace bandage in your book, A Fly for the Prosecution, correct?
Correct.
And those examples you spoke of involved a situation where presumably the bodies were wrapped before first oviposition, correct?
Correct.
And not a situation where oviposition began and then the body was wrapped, correct?
That's correct.
And to your knowledge, is it fair to say that there's no studies that deal with that second part, that oviposition began and then the body was wrapped?
I don't know of any that has specifically addressed that particular question.
And with regards to the laying of eggs, is it fair to say that some species of flies will not lay eggs in an area where there's predatory insects already there?
That is a possibility.
So going back to the finger, oh. Now, prior to forming your estimates, you had spoken with the Maui Police Department regarding some of the details of this case?
A little bit. Mostly I worked strictly based on the specimens that were submitted.
Okay,
My
but
typical pattern is that I don't try to be involved and realize the details of the case prior to formulating an estimate.
Well, wasn't there an email exchange between you and Anthony Earls prior to you even receiving the specimens, which gave you the time at which the decedent in this case was reported missing?
I don't recall whether or not the decedent was reported missing. I do recall email communication where we discussed what was being had been collected.
Now, again, going back to that example in your book, you specifically mentioned in that case scenario that it was beneficial that there was a weather station within a few miles from that scene. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And because that is of great aid, correct?
Yes, you always want to have the data as close as you can possibly get.
And again, if a cooler temperature obviously would take longer for the maggots to develop, right?
Correct.
I have no further questions.
I'll rewrite the examination.
Thank you. Dr. Goff, using the term junk in, junk out, did you feel any of the data that you received from the weather, the National Weather Station through the Maui Police Department was junk data?
No.
Based on your training, experience, your teaching, as well as your research. As you sit here today, can you rely on the data that was provided to you by the Maui Police Department through the National Weather Service?
Yes, I would rely on the National Weather Service data, no problem.
And given the numbers that the defense lawyer, I guess, provided you, does that change any of your findings in this case?
Based on what I have as firm data, this would not change any of my assumptions.
And when you made those findings, or you consider them to be assumptions, is that correct?
I consider them to be estimates.
Okay. When you, given your estimates, or based on your estimates, did you rely on any specific information from the Maui Police Department with respect to what they thought may have happened in this case as a basis for your estimates?
No.
And what did you solely base your estimates on?
I base my estimates on the weather data and the specimens that were provided to me.
So when counsel mentioned, when the defense attorney mentioned that about receiving an email containing specific information, did you get anything to that nature?
I don't recall a specific, say, time that the individual was missing in there. It might have been, but I do not recall it.
And with respect to the specimen that you inspected on a single nail, labeled as nail D, is it your testimony that that specimen or that maggot that you inspected would have become present during the second OV position or the first OV position?
The development indicates that that would be the time frame for the second
For the
position.
second.
Yes.
And you mentioned in your testimony while being cross-examined by the defense lawyer that, did I hear you right, that and the OV position did not start or did not start on the nail?
I don't believe I...
Or didn't take place on the nail? Did you say that?
Misstates testimony or assumes facts not in evidence.
No, I'm just trying to find out what you said about that.
Why don't you rephrase your question?
Did you mention anything about an OV position not beginning with the nail?
Well, if it's the second over position, then it would not have begun with the nail.
Okay. And when you say the second OV position would not have begun with the nail, what do you mean by that?
Basically, our first oval position would be the first oval position that took place. That didn't take place. They don't have specimens at that stage of development on the nail. Then that would indicate that the oval position on the nail or on whatever the nail was associated with took place at the later date.
Okay. I guess the other thing I was, and I think you mentioned it a little bit, the maggot mass that you saw in the state's photograph in that exhibit, can maggots, I guess, go into a mass that you saw in the photograph if there is body fluids and blood within the soil? Would that attract maggots?
That would attract maggots.
In the amount
Actually, it would attract the adult flies who would then lay the eggs that would
I'm
hatch
sorry.
the maggots.
Okay, so it would attract the flies that would lay their eggs where I guess the soil would have come to contact with the blood and I guess fluids from decomposition matter?
Yes.
And is that something that's common that you're aware of?
Yes.
And would that account for if there's no food source that you can see there, but you see a lot of maggot mass in an area, would that be an explanation why another explanation why the maggot mass would be concentrated in that area?
If you had a maggot mass of that size, that would indicate to me that there was something there more substantial as a food resource. The presence of the byproducts of decomposition of blood would be the trigger, more or less, or the rationale, as far as the maggot went, for remaining in that area.
For remaining in that area?
Yeah.
So if you had, if you had a body in that area and the maggot mass is there, and the body were removed, but the decomposition fluids and blood from that body remained in that area, would the maggot mass stay in that area?
It would stay in that area.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Alder. I have no further questions.
Request examination.
Now, again, going to this discrepancy of times, hypothetically speaking, if Wailuku Bay was just a couple degrees cooler than what's being reported at the Kahului weather station, is it fair to say when you look at the February, which you reported as the February 12th OB position, that would have taken place several hours later in the day?
Yeah, this goes back to the idea of him providing an estimate, not an absolute determination of the specific point in time.
And again, that would be consistent, though, that it would in fact happen not at 6, but 8 or 10 in the morning.
Yes, that's a possibility.
And is it fair to say that the, for lack of a better term, well, if a body's had time to begin decaying and is emitting the smells that would come with that, that would attract flies quicker than someone who's freshly deceased?
Not necessarily.
Reason? Is that what you would expect to see, though?
No, because the fresh body is very attractive to specific groups of early invaders, and the Chrysomya megacephala and Rufophosis would fall into that group. Bodies that have been decomposing for a period of time tend to attract other groups.
Okay. Now, but both OB positions in this case involve the fly that you just testified is attracted to, for lack of a better term, a fresh carcass. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. No further questions.
Are there any HR questions?
Yes, sir.
We'll let the jury go to the jury room. We'll be the questions.
I'll be outside, we're going to go through some jury.
Okay.
All right, I have a number of jury question forms. The first form is one question. It reads, did you double check with the archived data from the NWS, the weather/temperatures the MPD provided you as being from the National Weather Service to validate the information for February 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 2014 for your EDH calculations, Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
No objection. Are you okay? This question will be asked. Next, your question form. First question, do you believe the bra was not in an area easily accessible to the flies versus the outside of the green blanket? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr.
Well, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I think it does, it would involve speculation on his part. So
I agree, lacks foundation.
All right, sustained. Next question, was there any indication of any rainfall during the time frame of specimen collection? On which day, if any, Mr. Rivera?
no objection if he was informed.
No objection.
All right, this question will be asked. Next jury question form. First question, to clarify, an unconscious person with maggots in a wound is still alive but not alert. Maggots are feeding on the wound source as food. If the person awakes, they will still have maggots being alert, correct? Mr. Rivera?
Your Honor's compound.
I think that's vague, compound, assumes facts not in evidence. And confusing.
Uh, I'll allow the question. Next question. Did the improper preservative of the formaldehyde and not 35% isopropyl alcohol by Tony Earls alter your ADH, Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
Yeah, on the scope.
I'll allow the question. Next question is, most of your forensic bug work speculative. Mr. Rivera?
Argumentative. No objection, Your Honor.
Mr. Nardi?
No objection.
All right, this question will be asked. Next question. After a food source is removed, how long would it take a stage 2 larva to die? Oh, wait, it says, let me read that. After a food source is removed, how long would it take a stage 2 or 3 larva to die? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
Compound.
I'll allow the question. Next question. Will maggots feed on each other if the food source is removed or depleted? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
No objection.
All right, this question will be asked. Next jury question form. One question. Did you notice any maggots dead or dying to a lack of food / resources? Mr. Rivera?
Your Honor, he was never at the scene with the maggots, so that would call for speculation.
Mr. Nardi?
No objection if we can answer based on the specimens he did examine.
And the specimens were already dead, Your Honor.
But you can tell if some, I don't know about maggots, but you can certainly tell if a human died from lack of food. Starvation. As a cause of death, it's identifiable.
I'll allow the question. All right, next jury question form. First question. Could different types of vegetation surrounding specimen cause varying timelines of the life cycles of Diptera? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
No objection.
All right, this question will be asked. Next question, is it indicative of more or less amount of moisture This is, I guess, is a follow-up because it's in the same paragraph, but there's one line separating it. But at any rate, the question is it indicative of more or less amount of moisture or food source? I guess those two would be read together. Mr. Rivera?
I don't understand the second one yet.
Yeah, let me read the whole thing. Could different types of vegetation surrounding specimen cause varying timelines of the life cycles of Diptera? Is it indicative of more or less amount of moisture or food source?
No, I don't have an objection to the first part. The second one doesn't really match the first one.
I think they're both vague, I would object.
All right, well, I'll allow the first question. All right, next question. Do you believe you had an ample supply of specimen to experience a junk in, junk out analysis and conclusion? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
Vague, confusing.
All right, I'll allow the question. Next question. What was the average temperature readings that you were provided by the National Weather Service? Was the location where specimen were recovered, was it darkened by trees, shrubbery, or ground cover? Well, you know what, these are, I guess, separate questions. So first question would be, what was the average temperature readings you were provided by the National Weather Service? Mr. Rivera?
I do object to the form because he testified that he received hourly readings and there were no average readings. But I guess his answer could clarify that.
Mr. Nardi?
No objection.
All right, I'll allow the question. Next question. Was the location where the specimen were recovered, was it darkened by trees, shrubbery, or ground cover? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Nardi? All right, this question will be asked. Next jury question form. First two questions are crossed out. Remaining question. After the third instar larvae stage, the larvae turns into pupum. Where would you find this? Most likely occurrence. That's how it reads.
I think he can answer that. No objection.
All right, Mr.
I would object, vague, confusing.
I'll allow the question. Next question. Please explain where samples of the second instar specimen were found. Parentheses, e.g., gray sweater, black jeans, bra, etc. And then under that, ditto marks, and then third instar specimen.
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
Confusing.
I'll allow the question. Next question. Does the availability or inavailability of food source affect and or play into the acceleration or deceleration of life cycle the Diptera species? Please elaborate with examples.
No objection.
Mr. Nardi?
It's vague and kind of, to the extent it's talking about the life cycle, is kind of beyond the scope as far as rather than talking about this individual stages.
I'll allow the question. Next question. Was the weather documentation you received through the MPV provided exclusively by the National Weather Service? Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
Mr. Norton?
Foundation.
All right, I'll allow the question. Okay, question form, first question crossed out. Second question. Why is isopropyl alcohol preferred over formalin as a preservative of insects, Mr. Rivera?
No objection.
No objection.
All right, this question will be asked, and then the last question are. I'm having a bit of trouble reading this word. Maybe I'm just not looking at it right. Yeah, maybe that's okay. Okay, it appears to read are black flies omnivores?
No objection.
It's blowflies.
Hmm?
Blowflies is what the testimony was.
Yeah, I can't.
It is kind of.
It looks like an A, but
I don't think there's been any testimony about that type of fly.
maybe that's what it is though. Blowflies, maybe that's what it.
It says to the extent it doesn't say blowfly, I would object just beyond the scope.
You folks want to take a look at it and see what it says?
Yeah, why not?
Or if you have an opinion, I'm just having some trouble. I mean, sometimes, just go, right on that last question, second word. What are you reading it as?
Black.
Yeah, it looks like ELEV.
So what's your,
It could be lower. I don't see a C in there, so it could be blow.
I definitely see an L and an A.
no, there's an L there. It's definitely an L.
Looks like an A to me. Not a W.
You want me to read it as, are both flies omnivores? Is that what you're saying, Mr. Rivera?
That's fine, Your Honor.
Mr. Nuri?
To the extent we'd be changing something, I would object.
I don't know if I'm changing.
I don't either. I mean, like I said, it looks like black to me. And I think that's a street change.
I guess you folks can follow up on the different types of flies. So I'll allow the question. All right, we'll have the jury and witnesses turn. So you want to, okay.
Just,
Sure.
now would be good, and then we can go.
Okay, we'll take a recess.
Why is there recess?